In 1979, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was overthrown by a revolution that put an end to a monarchy that was more than 2,500 years old.
I didn't believe it was an uprising at first.
That's the way authoritarian regimes fall. First gradually, and then suddenly.
The Shah's mistake was to want to do too much too fast.
Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was the last Shah of Iran and a key figure in world politics during the second half of the 20th century. His arch-opponent was the Shiite Ayatollah Ruhollah Mossavi Khomeini, who became a beacon of resistance to the Shah's rule.
The two of them were polar opposites, both in terms of social image and personality.
They became very fierce antagonists, absolutely. And the Shah developed an almost obsession with them.
Their rivalry lasted almost a lifetime. Eventually the Shah was defeated, and with the Ayatollah's victory came Islamic fundamentalism, a new challenge for world politics. In September 1941, at the height of the Second World War, the Iranian parliament swore in 21-year-old Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as the country's new head of state. His father, Reza Shah Pahlavi, had declared Iran neutral, but made no secret of his sympathies with the Nazi regime. The Allies demanded his abdication. Since Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the British and Americans had been transporting heavy military equipment through Iran to aid Russians in their fight against the German Reich.
When Reza Shah abdicated and fled Iran, he left his son behind. Mohammad Reza stayed in Iran. Reza Shah told him to remain there and take over.
Mohammad Reza's father had prepared him for this moment from a young age. As Crown Prince, he'd always had a special role among his siblings. His father chose his son's playmates and sent him to an elite Swiss boarding school to receive a Western education. He also dictated who he would marry. The Egyptian princess, Fawzia, a union that ultimately would end in divorce. Reza Shah wanted this arranged marriage between the two ruling families to strengthen the power of the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran.
And he was a very, very powerful, charismatic figure who completely dominates the son's life.
300 kilometers southwest of the capital, Tehran, lies the oasis city of Khomeini. The youngest of 6 children, Ruhollah Mossavi Khomeini, was born here in 1902 in a house on the outskirts of the city. His father was murdered when he was just 5 years old. The case was officially never solved, but Khomeini always held Reza Shah responsible.
Until the end of his days, Ayatollah Khomeini thought that Reza Shah personally had intervened and to save the murder. That was that bitterness left in him, because in his writings, every now and then he says those whose fathers have been killed by Reza Shah.
Growing up without a father would shape the rest of Khomeini's life. His mother put him in the care of a wealthy aunt who made sure he got a good education. Khomeini started school aged 5. A village school teacher taught him to read and write, and he proved to be a quick learner, far more capable than his classmates. While the children played, he studied and read the Quran. Before Reza Shah was forced to abdicate, he had launched a comprehensive program of reforms. He wanted Iran to become a modern country, and one of his moves was to ban women from wearing the traditional veil known as the chador. The clergy accused him of meddling in their affairs, and a wave of protests ensued. Khomeini was now studying Islamic law, and he also felt that this was a fundamental violation of the principles of Islam. It must have come as a relief to Khomeini when Reza Shah was pressured by the Allies to abdicate. Khomeini demanded that Iran should return to being governed by Islamic law, but his demands fell on deaf ears. Reza Shah died in exile in South Africa in 1944. All eyes were on his son when he took over. People were intrigued to see how he would solve the conflict with the clergy that he had inherited from his father. Up until then, his public image had always been rather reserved. But the young Shah now showed surprising determination. Like his father, he wanted to modernize the country and its society, but he also wanted to end the religious dispute. Khomeini had by now started teaching Islamic law, and he found a willing audience among young students who were becoming increasingly radicalized. One Shiite fundamentalist group called itself Fada'iyan-e-Islam, the devotees of Islam. It still exists today. Its members came from poor districts of Tehran and campaigned for a theocratic state based on the Quran. They wanted all Western influences banned and to force women to cover up in public.
Within a couple of years, they really became very important because first of all, they assassinated a top intellectual, Mr. Ahmad Kasravi, who campaigned against Islam as a whole. Then they proceeded further and assassinated the Prime Minister, General Razmara. And Khomeini was the cleric who gave them clerical cover. Because, you know, in Islam, or at least in Shiite Islam, you can't just go and kill somebody unless a clerical authority writes a fatwa, as, for example, like Khomeini wrote against Salman Rushdie.
In early 1949, unknown attackers tried to kill the Shah. Many believed the devotees of Islam were behind the attempted assassination, although that was never proven. The Iranian parliament accused the pro-Moscow Today party and banned it, a move the Shah approved of because he was as suspicious of communism as he was of radical Islam. His political path was leading him toward the West.
I'm looking forward with the keenest anticipation to all that I have to experience here in the greatest of the democracies in a free world.
US President Harry S. Truman and the people of America gave Shah Mohammad Reza an exuberant welcome when he arrived in November 1949. Of course, this wasn't a purely selfless gesture. America was looking to gain access to the immense oil reserves in Iran. The Shah also needed support for his plans to modernize the country and was interested in technical innovations like the Hoover Dam. But not everyone shared his enthusiasm for the West.
Das Land war total abhängig.
The country was totally dependent. The Shah was dependent on the Americans and the British. But we wanted to have an independent state, a country that was in control of its own fate, one that made its own decisions.
The post-war global economic boom was fueled by one thing in particular: oil. The largest refinery in the world was being built in Abadan, not far from the Persian Gulf. Oil production had been a predominantly British enterprise since the start of the 20th century. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company in Iran was like a state within a state. In March 1951, the Iranian parliament decided to nationalize the oil industry and Britain cut off its supply to Iran. Many skilled British workers had to leave the country. The state's takeover of the oil facilities was popular, but the oil embargo soon caused an economic slump. Extreme parties like the Communist Tudeh Party exploited the crisis for their own ends. The Shah even briefly fled into exile to escape the line of fire. Several camps were now fighting for power in Iran, including the mullahs and their followers, and various political groups like the communists who wanted to abolish the monarchy in favor of a people's republic. The Shah could only hold on to his power with help from the US. The American intelligence service, the CIA, gave him money and helped him to set up his own secret police called Savak. The Shah was willing to team up with any ally who would fight against the influence of communism from the Soviet Union. The clerics were traditionally anti-communist and pro-monarchy, so he tried to win them over to his side. But it didn't work.
He certainly thought that that ideological backing was religion. And that's, again, another mistake that he made. Religion, particularly as incarnated by the Shia clergy, could never have become the ideological framework on which to build modernization and westernization.
In December 1959, Tehran witnessed huge celebrations. Press photographers from all over the world fought for the best picture of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and his new wife, Farah Diba. After 2 failed marriages, his third wife, the new queen, would soon give birth to the much-awaited heir to the throne and ensure the future of the Pahlavi dynasty. With the Shah by her side, Farah Pahlavi became an influential figure in her own right. She accompanied him on his trip to America in April 1962, where the couple were warmly received. Together with John F. Kennedy as president, the Shah intensified Iran-US relations. The two of them agreed that only a strong military could fend off the latent threat from the Soviet Union. The US promised aid to strengthen Iran's armed forces, and in return for weapons, America would get oil.
The Americans gave the Shah modern weapons to build up his armed forces. There were countless military advisors in Iran who decided what would be done and what wouldn't. And the things they did were certainly not a service to democracy.
In the 1960s, Iran was still very much a developing country. Most people were tenant farmers, with most of the land in the hands of feudal lords and big landowners, including numerous mullahs and religious foundations. On January the 11th, 1963, the Shah put forward a comprehensive reform program aimed at significantly improving the people's living conditions. He called it the White Revolution.
The White Revolution that His Majesty decided to undertake was truly his idea and his decision. He wanted his country and his people to develop.
A nationwide referendum was held and the vast majority voted in favor of the ambitious program. It aimed to abolish the feudal system, privatize state-owned companies, combat illiteracy, and give women the right to vote. They weren't allowed to vote in the referendum, but were allowed to fill in unofficial ballot papers to register their support off the record.
He wanted Iran to modernize. The White Revolution was intended to make Iran better, and it did. In many, many ways it did. It ended feudalism in Iran. That's not an easy thing to do.
The starting point of the White Revolution was a land reform, which met with staunch resistance from the clergy. the Shah gave more than 500,000 hectares, an area twice the size of Luxembourg, to 30,000 poor families.
There were rumors that the Shah's reforms were carried out under pressure from America, which would have meant they would only have served colonial and imperialist interests, and not those of the Iranian people. In other words, they were being carried out on American orders.
So-called educational soldiers were sent to village schools to teach children how to read, write, and count. Adult farmers and nomads also had to go to school. The Shah included people from all social classes in his campaign.
There was an army for literacy, but not for real education. I mean, of course it's a good thing that people are literate, but literacy doesn't equal political education. There's a big difference. And political education was banned in schools and in universities.
Khomeini became the spokesman for a group of mullahs who rejected this policy as being pro-Western.
At the time, the Ayatollah Khomeini was someone who represented the people and the opposition. He bravely articulated their demands, which is why we supported him.
Khomeini was now very much in the public eye. He was no longer the young clergyman he had been in the city of Qom, complaining about Reza Shah and holding back out of respect for his teachers. Now, he was the grand Ayatollah. He'd gathered a considerable following and had much more potential to mobilize the people.
Khomeini took advantage of this enhanced power, emerging from the shadows and adopting an aggressive stance towards the Shah's policies. For the first time, he publicly warned him against continuing in the ways of his father.
Khomeini sent a couple of letters directly addressed to the Shah, and the Shah gave a couple of speeches directly responding to him. I've quoted those at length in the Shah book, and they're remarkable. Khomeini, for his defiance, telling the Shah, boy, don't do something so that I throw you out of the country like your father. And the Shah saying these little, the word is like ants, like who survive in feces. We are not going to let them rule this country.
A key element of the White Revolution was to strengthen the role of women in Iranian society. Iranian women enjoyed their newly acquired rights and the self-confidence that came with them. Not only could women vote, they could even run for political office. It was a milestone on the journey towards female emancipation. Khomeini and his followers believed the foundations of their faith were under threat from the new role of women in politics and society, and hit back. Khomeini denounced corruption, state violence, and the torture employed by the Savak secret police, threatening what he called the tyrants of our time with a black reaction to the White Revolution.
Khomeini war der Einzige, der
Back then, Khomeini was the only one who spoke out against the Shah. He threatened to portray him as a sinful person, a religiously sinful person, and to organize a revolt against him.
Gedroht, einen Aufstand gegen ihn zu organisieren.
Demonstrations and counter-demonstrations swept the country. The Shah sent the army into the holy city of Qum, and Khomeini was arrested and sentenced to death. The sentence was mitigated after intervention from the clergy, but Khomeini was forced into exile in Najaf in Iraq. Meanwhile, the White Revolution was running into problems in the countryside. The farmers now had their own fields to cultivate, but they often lacked seeds, water, and modern farming equipment.
The land reform resulted in people having to move out of their villages and into the cities, such as Tehran. But they couldn't live in the city centres, so they settled on the outskirts. It was these marginalised communities that became the soldiers of the revolution.
When Khomeini arrived in Najaf, the stronghold of Shiite Islam in Iraq, he initially withdrew from public life. Now aged 60, he was isolated and believed that his time was coming to an end. Many Iranian clerics wanted nothing to do with his political activities. He started taking a renewed interest in the study of the Holy Scriptures and talked with just a few of his students to keep up to date with the situation in Iran. Family members who had accompanied him into exile were amongst his few supporters.
He was this distant figure, very little interest in anything other than his mosque and his books. He never went once 2 blocks from his house, the other side, to see a river. He went to his mosque and came home for 14 years.
Back in Iran, the Shah had always maintained that he wanted to achieve something for his country before he finally ascended the peacock throne. Now he finally allowed himself to be crowned in a lavish coronation in October 1967. He knew how important it was to display the dynasty's religious foundations and had always involved the clergy in his public appearances. So he had their support as he took up his rightful place as the new Shahanshah, the King of Kings. He also had his wife crowned Empress, an elevation unprecedented in Iran's long history.
When His Majesty placed the crown on my head, it was as if he put it on the heads of all women. It was a very important moment in the history of our country. I didn't think that I had become important in my own right. I saw it as a sign of progress and respect for women.
Earlier in 1967, the glamorous couple had been on a state visit to the Federal Republic of Germany, where they were greeted by President Karl Heinrich Lübke and Chancellor Kurt Georg Kiesinger. The visit focused primarily on economic ties between the two countries. The Shah visited the big steel companies along the Rhine and Ruhr. He needed help to industrialize his country, for example, building new dams for agricultural irrigation. It was a lucrative opportunity for German businesses. But the ugly side of the Shah's regime was revealed during the couple's visit to the opera in Berlin, when members of SAVAK attacked demonstrators protesting against oppression and torture in Iran. The situation escalated, and the Shah's visit and the protests against his policies became a turning point in the history of West Germany. To drive his White Revolution forward, the Shah used capital from abroad to upgrade his country's technology. He invested billions in electrification and in various industries. He wanted Iran to catch up with the modern world and become the global power it once was.
I think that our country in the next 10 years will be what you are today. In the next 25 years, according to other people, I'm not saying that, will be among the 5 most prosperous countries of the world.
The Iranian capital in particular had started opening up to Western culture and was quickly becoming a modern metropolis. Very few women still covered up in public, and young people could travel freely and get an education abroad. Tehran's people enjoyed all the advantages of a cosmopolitan city where they were free to express themselves. But as far as the political structures were concerned, nothing had changed. Embodied by the Shah himself, the monarchy remained all-powerful and unaccountable.
wollte alles alleine entscheiden. Und das war der Fehler, der
He wanted to decide everything all by himself.
alle Misserfolge, die
That was the mistake behind all his failures,
letztendlich
and what ultimately led to his
zu
demise.
seinem Ende geführt hat.
The Shah's ministers didn't have the courage to tell him about the country's poor economic situation. This had been caused by changes imposed from above. The move towards an authoritarian regime rife with corruption, crime, and the murder of intellectuals. The country was bleeding to death intellectually. It was a betrayal, as if Iran were under foreign rule.
In Najaf, however, time seemed to have stood still. Khomeini was still giving lectures to a small circle of students and thinking about how an Islamic legal system where the clergy played a leading role would look. He condemned Western shallowness and hedonism. He attacked the colonial powers and Israel, and he called for an end to the separation of politics and religion. The transcripts of his lectures were published in a book entitled Islamic Government.
I think I was one of the maybe first people to read it. I was shocked by it. But I, like a lot of other simple people like me, thought this would never work. This is a medieval idea. Iran, that has had a constitutional revolution in 1905-07, is not going to let the clergy come and cut off people's hands in public squares. And it's not going to let the clergy rule because they know Sharia. I was wrong, as were a lot of other countries and forces.
Iran wanted to stop the spread of radical ideas and theological demands from Shiite clergy and banned Khomeini's book. But this censorship only made it more attractive to opponents of the ruling class. Anyone who opposed the Shah's regime could expect to end up in Savak's cells, where torture and executions were commonplace. There was no escape from this dreaded prison in Tehran, which German architects had built in the 1930s. This is what the students in Germany were protesting at during the Shah's visit. Even some of Iran's current political leaders were imprisoned here during the Shah's rule, including today's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. The Shah's regime was totally intolerant of opposition or even dissent. There was no open dialogue about the country's social and political development, and political parties, both left and right, were largely stamped out. The opposition had either fled abroad or been locked up. The Shah's autocratic rule meant he was increasingly losing touch with the people of his country. Tehran, with its modern high-rise buildings, had come to symbolize a belief in progress. But many people were no longer able to keep pace with the Shah. So they turned to the institution that was familiar to them, one that had always provided support in times of uncertainty.
It completely went after the left, whether it was the left that was dependent on the Soviet Union or whether it was the social democratic left. The only people who were allowed to build mosques, build schools, teach their own cadres were the religious folks. And you bring millions into the cities, in shanty towns, concentrate them, made them easy to mobilize, and allow the clergy to be the only one who's active there. And then people are surprised that the revolution was won by the clergy.
During the 1970s, the Shah renovated many of the country's mosques and greatly increased the number of Quran schools as well. He wanted to reassure the clergy that Islam was fundamentally important to him, that it was the very foundation of Iranian society, despite the orientation of his policies towards the West. Through his public appearances and his annual pilgrimage to the city of Mashhad, considered one of the 7 holy sites of Shia Islam, he hoped to keep the clergy firmly on his side.
He saw religion as his last line of defense. He saw religion as his most powerful stronghold within the country. And that's where he made a massive miscalculation, massive strategic and ideological and political miscalculation, because what he thought of as his most powerful stronghold and backing turned out to be his most fatal and dangerous enemy.
In 1978, an inflammatory article about Khomeini in a leading daily newspaper accused him and the clergy of mounting a counter-revolution. His followers took to the streets in Qum to show their solidarity.
It was the fast-moving revolution. Maybe it is the fastest revolution in human history, because everything happened within 4 months.
With every passing day, the resolve of the Shah's regime to stay in power was weakening, and the resolve of the opposition to demand his removal was increasing.
As many as 300 people were killed at the demonstration in Qum. There was a 40-day mourning period, as is customary in Islam, but straight after that, hundreds of thousands took to the streets again, their numbers swelling by the day. The Shah wasn't prepared for resistance on this scale. It took him and his regime completely off guard and left it paralyzed. An arson attack on the Rex cinema in the oil city of Abadan on August the 19th, 1978, killed 422 people. The opposition accused the secret police and the Shah. However, evidence later suggested that Khomeini himself had masterminded the attack.
After Cinema Rex, it was a different story, both in magnitude, in the anger, and in the slogans. For the first time I heard thousands of people say death to the Shah. That would have been unimaginable in '77.
The protests became increasingly violent, and the military was called to intervene. September the 8th, 1978 would go down in history as Black Friday. It's not known how many people were killed on central Tehran's Jaleh Square that day. Estimates range from less than 100 to 15,000. An ensuing general strike brought the country to a standstill.
The Shah had a strong military and intelligence service, so all the instruments of power were in his hands. That's why many people, like me, thought, let's first try to overthrow the regime with Khomeini, and then we'll deal with him later.
The Shah pressured the Iraqi government to declare Khomeini persona non grata, and he had to leave his exile in Najaf. His aides advised him to head to Europe, which he at first rejected, asking them what he would do in a non-Islamic country. Little did he know that thousands of his followers from all over the world would make a pilgrimage to his new home in Neaufles-le-Château, a small suburb of Paris. Western politicians and intellectuals like Jean-Paul Sartre, Michel Foucault, and François Mitterrand also showed support for Khomeini. In France, he suddenly found himself at the center of global attention. Nobody talked about the radical ideas Khomeini had expressed in his book about Islamic government. Since his writings were banned in Iran and unknown in the West, no one even raised the subject with him. His speeches against the Shah were recorded and distributed throughout Iran.
We spread these speeches around in every form possible. We handed the tapes out all over the place. And we even took them to the villages.
The generals in Iran were waiting for Mohammad Reza to order them to take action against the insurgents. But nobody realized that the Shah was suffering from cancer and was physically weak. Without orders, the military held its fire. Once the soldiers had stopped shooting down civilians, people put flowers in their guns and held pictures of Khomeini in their hands in a celebration of their future leader. But then the Shah used a television address to try and regain the initiative.
من نیز پیام انقلاب شما ملت ایران را شنیدم. تضمین می‌کنم که حکومت ایران در آینده بر اساس قانون اساسی، عدالت اجتماعی و اراده ملی و بدور از استبداد و ظلم و فساد خواهد بود.
He looked weak. He looked absolutely despondent. He couldn't read the text. And the point that he was saying is that I have heard, that's the famous phrase, I have heard the call of your revolution and give me another chance. And people saw it rightly as a sign of his weakness. If ever there was a sign that he is not going to be able to master the situation, that was, to me, the speech.
The international community was alarmed by the crisis in Iran, and French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing invited German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, US President Jimmy Carter, and British Prime Minister Jim Callaghan to a meeting on the island of Guadeloupe to discuss what to do.
Our talks had a twofold objective: to increase security and reduce tension around the world. We thought we needed to recognize the realities of today's world and increase our efforts to improve international relations.
Western powers decided that meant abandoning the Shah and his regime. On January the 16th, 1979, he left Iran with his family. The Shah thought the crisis would soon be over and he would be able to return, but in actual fact, it was goodbye forever.
I'll never forget the tears in his eyes when we left, and the officer who threw himself at His Majesty's feet.
14 days later, on February the 1st, 1979, Khomeini flew from Paris to Tehran. Many feared that the Shah's air force would thwart Khomeini's return by forcing the plane off course or even shooting it down.
Boarding that plane, in spite of the danger, well, you couldn't feel safe. Of course you'd be worried. Khomeini didn't show any sign of fear, but he must have been afraid. Anyone would be.
Khomeini set foot on Iranian soil after 14 years in exile. Millions of people jubilantly celebrated his return. The Iranian monarchy had come to an end after 2,500 years, and Khomeini was welcomed as a savior. Nobody had any idea of the consequences the Islamic Revolution would have for Iran.
Virtually all our intellectuals supported Khomeini, from right to left, including those who had supported the Shah. All our big business, our big tycoons, our billionaires, they all supported him. So he had created a degree of unity among all these different factions in Tehran, which was impressive.
Khomeini's first visits were to Behesht-e-Zahra Cemetery on the outskirts of Tehran, where those who were killed by the Shah's regime are buried, and to the holy city of Qum, where his fight against the Shah had begun many years ago.
The confrontation between these two could be summarized to the confrontation of two opposing will. And in such a confrontation, it is always the stronger will that will win, and that's exactly what happened in Iran. Khomeini's will was far stronger to conquer power than the Shah's will to keep power.
After a long odyssey through various different countries, the Shah died of cancer on July the 27th, 1980 in Cairo. He was 60 years old. His body was buried in the Al-Rifai Mosque in the Egyptian capital. The Ayatollah Khomeini died from a heart attack on June the 3rd, 1989 in Tehran. During his 10-year reign, he followed through on his ideas of an Islamic revolution with uncompromising stringency and turned Iran into a theocracy. And in doing so, he set in motion a dynamic process that even now still keeps the world anxiously guessing.